The scorching July heat of 1996 shimmered off the asphalt as 17-year-old Sarah Mitchell adjusted her baseball cap and checked her backpack one final time. The parking lot of Red Rock Canyon State Park in California's Mojave Desert was nearly empty at 6 a.m., save for the small group of teenage explorers and their adult chaperones preparing for what was supposed to be a 3-day geological expedition. Sarah had been looking forward to this trip for months, ever since her earth sciences teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, announced the summer program for advanced students interested in pursuing careers in geology or environmental science. "Remember, we stick together at all times," Mrs. Rodriguez called out to the group of 8 students as they gathered around 2 dusty SUVs loaded with camping equipment, scientific instruments, and enough water to last a week in the desert. The desert is beautiful, but unforgiving. Nobody wanders off alone, understood? The teenagers nodded enthusiastically, their excitement palpable despite the early hour and the already oppressive heat that promised to reach dangerous levels by midday. Sarah's best friend Jessica grabbed her arm, bouncing slightly on her toes despite the weight of her heavy backpack. "I can't believe we're actually doing this. My dad thinks I'm crazy for choosing rocks over the beach this summer, but this is going to be so much better than lying around getting sunburned in Santa Monica." Jessica had only signed up for the expedition because Sarah had begged her to come along, but she was getting caught up in her friend's infectious enthusiasm for the adventure ahead. If you're enjoying this story of mystery and human perseverance, please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love connecting with viewers from around the world who share our fascination with unsolved mysteries. Sarah laughed, her bright smile reflecting the optimism and curiosity that had always defined her personality. She was the kind of teenager who collected fossils instead of makeup, who spent weekends hiking with her father in the San Gabriel Mountains, rather than hanging out at the Westfield Century City Mall like most of her classmates. Her bedroom walls were covered with geological survey maps and photographs of rock formations from around the world, and she had already been accepted to UC Berkeley's prestigious geology program, scheduled to begin in the fall. Her parents, David and Linda Mitchell, had initially been hesitant about letting their only daughter venture into the remote desert with a group of teenagers, despite their trust in Mrs. Rodriguez's experience and qualifications. David, an insurance adjuster who had seen too many accident reports involving inexperienced hikers in California's wilderness areas, had spent hours researching the safety protocols for the expedition. Linda, a high school librarian with a tendency to worry about everything from car accidents to food poisoning, had made Sarah promise to call every evening on the group's satellite phone. "She's responsible and smart," David had told his wife the night before, as they watched Sarah methodically pack her supplies with the same careful attention to detail she brought to everything in her life. "If anyone can handle this kind of adventure, it's our Sarah. Besides, she needs this experience for her college applications, and Mrs. Rodriguez has been leading these trips for over 10 years without any serious incidents." The first day of the expedition exceeded everyone's expectations. The group explored ancient rock formations that told the story of millions of years of geological activity, collected samples of different mineral compositions, and learned about the powerful forces that had shaped the Mojave Desert long before humans ever set foot in North America. Sarah was completely in her element, carefully documenting everything in her leather-bound field notebook, while her silver digital watch, a gift from her grandmother for her 16th birthday, glinted in the intense desert sun. The watch had become something of a trademark for Sarah. It was a sophisticated piece of technology for 1996, featuring multiple time zones, an altimeter, and a compass function that she found invaluable during her hiking expeditions with her father. Her grandmother had saved for months to buy it, knowing how much Sarah would appreciate both its practical applications and its symbolic significance as a tool for serious scientific exploration. That evening, as they set up camp near a cluster of ancient Joshua trees that stood like sentinels against the star-filled desert sky, Sarah called her parents on the group's satellite phone, her voice crackling with static, but clear enough to convey her excitement about the day's discoveries. "Mum, you should see the sunset out here," she said, pausing to watch the sky transform into a canvas of orange, pink, and purple hues. "It's like the whole world is on fire, but in the most beautiful way possible. I took so many photographs, and wait until you see the rock samples I collected today. Mrs. Rodriguez thinks one of them might actually contain evidence of ancient marine fossils." Linda Mitchell smiled as she listened to her daughter's enthusiasm, though a mother's instinctive worry gnawed at the edges of her contentment. She had always been proud of Sarah's independence and intelligence, but the idea of her child sleeping under the open sky in one of the most dangerous environments in North America made her stomach clench with anxiety. "Just promise me you're being careful, sweetheart," she said, trying to keep the concern out of her voice. "And remember what we talked about. Stay with the group at all times, drink plenty of water, and don't take any unnecessary risks just to get a better photograph or rock sample." Sarah promised, meaning every word at the time, though she had no way of knowing how quickly circumstances would conspire to make that promise impossible to keep. As she settled into her sleeping bag that night, surrounded by the vast silence of the desert and the brilliant canopy of stars, visible only in places far from city lights, she felt a profound sense of connection to the natural world and excitement about the discoveries that tomorrow might bring. The second day brought an unexpected discovery that would change everything and set in motion a chain of events that would haunt everyone involved for the next 27 years. The morning started routinely enough, with the group breaking camp at sunrise to avoid the worst of the midday heat that was predicted to reach 118 degrees Fahrenheit. Mrs. Rodriguez had planned for them to explore a particularly interesting geological formation about 2 miles from their overnight campsite, where satellite imagery had suggested the presence of unusual rock striations that might indicate significant mineral deposits or evidence of ancient volcanic activity. While examining the formation, which rose from the desert floor like a massive sculpture carved by millions of years of wind and water erosion, Mrs. Rodriguez made the decision to split the group into pairs to cover more ground efficiently. Each pair was equipped with a radio, extra water, and strict instructions to stay within visual contact of at least one other pair at all times. The area they were exploring was relatively open, with good sightlines in all directions, and the rock formation itself provided a central landmark that would make it difficult for anyone to become seriously disoriented. Sarah was partnered with Marcus Thompson, a quiet but knowledgeable 17-year-old from her advanced placement chemistry class who shared her interest in the intersection of geology and environmental science. Marcus was planning to study environmental engineering at Caltech, and he saw this expedition as an opportunity to gain hands-on experience with the kind of fieldwork that might define his future career. He was methodical and careful by nature, qualities that made him an ideal partner for the kind of detailed scientific observation they were expected to conduct. They had been working together for about an hour, taking photographs and collecting samples while maintaining radio contact with the other pairs, when Sarah spotted something unusual in a narrow canyon about 100 yards away from their assigned area. The formation caught her attention because the rock face showed dramatically different geological characteristics from everything they had observed so far: different colors, different textures, and what appeared to be evidence of water erosion patterns that didn't match the arid conditions of the current climate. "Marcus, look at that rock face over there," she called out, pointing toward the shadowy gap between 2 towering formations that rose nearly 100 feet from the desert floor. See how the striations are completely different from everything we've been looking at? The mineral composition has to be different too. Look at how the light reflects off those surfaces. That could indicate the presence of mica or quartz deposits that formed under completely different conditions. Marcus squinted in the direction she indicated, but the intense midday heat was beginning to affect his concentration and judgment. He'd been feeling dizzy for the past 20 minutes, despite drinking water regularly, and all he wanted was to find some shade and rest for a few minutes before continuing their work. "I don't know, Sarah," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "Maybe we should head back and mention it to Mrs. Rodriguez. I'm starting to feel pretty dehydrated, and we're supposed to stay within the designated area." But Sarah's scientific curiosity was fully engaged, and she was experiencing the kind of focused excitement that had driven her to excel in every academic challenge she had ever encountered. She checked her watch, 1:30 p.m., and calculated they had plenty of time before the scheduled 3 p.m. rendezvous back at the base camp. The canyon was clearly visible from their current position, and it didn't appear to be more than a 5-minute walk to reach the interesting rock formation and back. "It'll just take 5 minutes to get a closer look, and maybe take a few photographs," she insisted, already adjusting her camera settings and checking her water supply. "We can see the other groups from here, and if we find something really significant, Mrs. Rodriguez will want to bring the whole team over to investigate. This could be exactly the kind of discovery that makes this whole expedition worthwhile." Marcus reluctantly agreed, though something in his gut told him they should return to the others immediately and report their observation through proper channels. Later, he would replay this moment thousands of times, wondering what would have happened if he had been more insistent about following protocol. But at the time, Sarah's confidence and enthusiasm were persuasive, and he didn't want to appear overcautious in front of someone whose academic abilities he respected and admired. They approached the narrow canyon carefully, noting the dramatic drop in temperature as they entered the shadowed area between the rock walls that provided blessed relief from the punishing sun. Sarah was immediately fascinated by what she saw. Layers of sedimentary rock that seemed to tell a complex story, spanning thousands or possibly millions of years of geological activity. The formations were unlike anything in her textbooks, and she began taking photographs and detailed notes with the systematic thoroughness that had made her one of the top students in her graduating class. Marcus, meanwhile, was growing increasingly uncomfortable with their isolation from the main group and the amount of time they were spending in an area they weren't supposed to be exploring without supervision. The canyon was deeper and more complex than it had appeared from a distance, with several branching passages that led deeper into the rock formation. The shadows and the acoustic properties of the enclosed space made it difficult to maintain orientation, and he was beginning to feel genuinely concerned about their ability to retrace their steps. "Sarah, we really should head back now," he urged after what felt like much longer than the 5 minutes she had promised, though when he checked his own watch, he was surprised to discover that only 15 minutes had actually passed. The combination of heat, dehydration, and anxiety was distorting his perception of time and making him increasingly desperate to return to the safety and supervision of the main group. But when he turned around to insist that they leave immediately, Sarah was nowhere to be seen. The narrow canyon had several branches and alcoves, and in his focus on the rock formations and his growing discomfort, Marcus hadn't noticed exactly which direction she had gone. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He had lost sight of his partner in one of the most dangerous and unforgiving environments on Earth, and he had no idea how long she had been gone, or which of several possible passages she might have taken. "Sarah!" he called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls and returning to him distorted and amplified in ways that made the sound seem alien and frightening. "Sarah, where are you? We need to go back right now." "Wait, The only response was the sound of wind whistling through the rock formations high above and the distant cry of a hawk circling in the brutal desert heat. Marcus felt panic rising in his chest as he realized that what had seemed like a simple scientific detour had somehow transformed into a life-threatening emergency that could have consequences none of them had ever imagined. Meanwhile, completely unaware of Marcus's growing panic, Sarah had discovered what appeared to be a hidden passage deeper into the canyon system that seemed to lead toward an area of even more interesting geological formations. Her scientific mind was racing with possibilities as she carefully made her way through the narrow opening. This could be evidence of underground water systems that had carved these passages over millions of years, or perhaps even the entrance to undiscovered cave formations that might contain fossils or mineral deposits of significant scientific value. She paused to check her watch, 2:15 p.m., and calculated that she still had 45 minutes before the scheduled rendezvous time, which seemed like plenty of time to conduct a preliminary exploration and return to Marcus with enough information to convince Mrs. Rodriguez to authorize a more thorough investigation of the area. The passage was narrow but stable, with solid rock on all sides and no sign of the kind of loose material that might indicate a risk of rockfall or structural instability. What Sarah didn't realize, and couldn't have known without extensive experience in desert geology, was that the passage she was exploring was actually part of a complex network of interconnected canyons and rock formations that had been carved by centuries of flash floods and erosion. What appeared from the entrance to be a straightforward path actually led to a maze-like system that could disorient even experienced hikers and spelunkers. With each turn, she was moving further away from Marcus, from the main group, and from any realistic possibility of rescue, drawn forward by an insatiable scientific curiosity that had always been her greatest strength, but was now becoming her most dangerous liability. The passage opened into a larger chamber that took Sarah's breath away. The walls were covered with mineral formations that caught and reflected her camera flash in ways that created an almost otherworldly beauty. She spent several minutes photographing everything from multiple angles, taking detailed notes about the colors and textures she observed, and collecting small samples that she hoped to analyze more thoroughly back at school. The chamber had several exits, and she chose the one that seemed most likely to lead to additional formations worth investigating. By the time she realized she was lost, Sarah had been gone from Marcus for over an hour and had penetrated so deeply into the canyon system that her voice wouldn't carry back to the entrance, even if she shouted at the top of her lungs. The passages all looked similar, and without distinctive landmarks to guide her, she quickly became disoriented and unable to retrace her steps. The cool temperature that had initially been such a relief from the desert heat was now becoming a source of concern as she realized that the sun would set in a few hours, bringing with it the kind of temperature drop that could be fatal to someone caught without proper shelter in the desert. She tried to remain calm and apply the survival principles her father had taught her during their hiking expeditions, but the growing realization that she was completely alone in an unmapped underground system with limited water and no way to signal for help was beginning to overwhelm even her naturally optimistic disposition and strong survival instincts. Back at the surface, Marcus had spent nearly 30 minutes searching every visible area of the canyon system and calling Sarah's name with increasing desperation before accepting the terrible reality that he needed to get help immediately. The hike back to the main group felt like the longest walk of his life, with every step weighted down by the knowledge that he had failed in his most basic responsibility to keep track of his partner. By the time he reached Mrs. Rodriguez and the other students, he was nearly incoherent with panic, dehydration, and the crushing guilt of having allowed Sarah to disappear on his watch. "She was right behind me," he kept repeating as Mrs. Rodriguez tried to get coherent information about Sarah's last known location and the circumstances of her disappearance. We were looking at the rock formations, and I told her we should go back. And then when I turned around, she was just gone. I looked everywhere I could think of, but there are so many passages, and they all look the same. Mrs. Rodriguez immediately understood the gravity of the situation and began implementing the emergency protocols she had hoped never to use. She contacted the park rangers on her radio while organizing the other students and chaperones into search teams, but even as she coordinated the immediate response, she knew that finding someone lost in the vast and complex terrain of the Mojave Desert was a race against time that they might already be losing. The next several hours unfolded like a nightmare that would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives. The harsh desert environment worked against every search effort. Temperatures that had reached their predicted high of 118 degrees during the afternoon began to drop rapidly as evening approached, and the complex terrain made navigation treacherous even for the park rangers, who knew the area better than anyone else. Helicopter searches were hampered by the narrow passages and overhanging rock formations that made visual identification nearly impossible, and the vast scale of the potential search area meant that even dozens of searchers could easily miss someone who was injured or trapped in one of the countless hidden alcoves and passages that riddled the canyon system. David and Linda Mitchell received the phone call that every parent dreads at 7:45 p.m. that evening, just as they were sitting down to dinner and looking forward to Sarah's scheduled evening check-in call. Mrs. Rodriguez's voice was carefully controlled as she delivered the news, but the underlying panic and guilt were unmistakable, even through the static of the satellite phone connection. "Mr. Mitchell, there's been an incident during today's expedition. Sarah became separated from her partner this afternoon while they were conducting field research, and despite extensive search efforts, we haven't been able to locate her yet. I want you to know that we've contacted park rangers and professional search and rescue teams, and we're doing absolutely everything possible to find her and bring her home safely." The 4-hour drive from their comfortable suburban home in Pasadena to the remote desert location of Red Rock Canyon State Park was the longest journey of David and Linda's lives. 4 hours during which they experienced every emotion from desperate hope to paralyzing terror. 4 hours of trying to convince themselves that their capable, intelligent daughter would find a way to survive until help could reach her. 4 hours of imagining scenarios too horrible to contemplate, but impossible to push from their minds. They arrived at the hastily established search command post in the park's main parking area to find a scene of controlled chaos that would become numbingly familiar over the following weeks. Dozens of volunteers, park rangers, search and rescue specialists, and law enforcement officers were coordinating search patterns, managing communications, and preparing equipment for what everyone knew would be a round-the-clock effort that might continue for days or even weeks, depending on what they found or didn't find. Linda Mitchell would later describe that first night as the beginning of a waking nightmare that would define the rest of her life. The desert that had seemed like such an exciting adventure destination for Sarah now appeared as a vast, hostile wasteland that could hide 1,000 secrets and swallow any trace of a missing person without leaving so much as a footprint or a scrap of fabric to guide searchers to the right location. The professional searchers were kind but realistic about the challenges they faced, and their carefully worded explanations of search protocols and survival statistics did nothing to ease the growing certainty that something terrible had happened to the bright, curious teenager who had simply wanted to take a closer look at some interesting rock formations. The search for Sarah Mitchell would ultimately become one of the most extensive operations in the history of the Mojave Desert. involving helicopter crews equipped with thermal imaging equipment, specially trained K-9 units capable of tracking scents across rocky terrain, ground-penetrating radar systems, and hundreds of volunteers who combed every accessible square mile of the surrounding area. But despite all the technology, manpower, and expertise brought to bear on the case, the vast and unforgiving landscape seemed to have swallowed Sarah without leaving any trace that searchers could follow. Professional search and rescue teams understood the grim mathematics of survival in desert conditions. Without adequate water and shelter, a person could survive perhaps 3 days in the extreme temperatures of the Mojave in July. With proper preparation and a little luck, that timeline might extend to a week, but as the days turned into weeks with no sign of Sarah or any of her equipment, even the most optimistic searchers began to privately acknowledge that they were no longer looking for a survivor. They were looking for closure, for some trace that would allow the Mitchell family to begin the difficult process of grief and acceptance. David Mitchell refused to accept these statistics or the gradually shifting focus of the search operation. Long after the professional teams had scaled back their efforts and most of the volunteers had returned to their normal lives, he continued to spend every daylight hour hiking through the same canyon systems where his daughter had vanished, calling her name until his voice was raw and his feet were bloody from traversing the sharp rocks in hiking boots that had never been designed for such punishment. Linda coordinated with media outlets, missing persons organizations, and online communities dedicated to unsolved disappearances, ensuring that Sarah's photograph and story appeared in newspapers, on television screens, and on early internet bulletin boards across the state and eventually the entire country. She became an expert in the bureaucracy of missing persons cases, learning to navigate the complex relationships between different law enforcement agencies and the frustrating limitations of search protocols in cases where no crime was immediately apparent. But as the initial weeks of intensive searching turned into months, and the months stretched toward a full year without any significant leads or discoveries, the case gradually faded from public attention, despite the family's continued efforts to keep Sarah's story in the news. Missing persons cases involving adults, and at 17, Sarah was legally considered an adult for many purposes. Rarely maintained media interest for extended periods, unless there was evidence of foul play or other sensational elements that would capture public imagination. The Mitchell family's ordeal became one of ambiguous loss, a psychological concept that describes the unique trauma experienced by families of missing persons who must continue their lives without knowing whether their loved one is alive or dead. Unlike families dealing with confirmed deaths who can eventually begin the process of grief and healing, families of the missing exist in a perpetual state of uncertainty that makes normal emotional processing impossible. Every phone call could bring news. Every knock on the door might be someone with information. Every unidentified body discovered anywhere in the Southwest meant another trip to a coroner's office or morgue for the terrible ritual of hoping that finally, mercifully, they would have answers. What nobody could have predicted during those agonizing months of 1996 and 1997 was that 27 years later, in the summer of 2023, a routine maintenance inspection of abandoned vehicles in a remote area of the park would uncover evidence that would transform the Sarah Mitchell case from a tragic story of someone lost in the wilderness into something far more sinister and complex. The discovery would vindicate Linda Mitchell's long-held belief that the official explanation for her daughter's disappearance had never made complete sense, and it would launch a new investigation that would ultimately reveal connections to other missing persons cases stretching across multiple states and spanning nearly a decade. Park maintenance worker Carlos Hernandez had been employed by the California Department of Parks and Recreation for 15 years, long enough to become familiar with the sad reality that remote desert locations attracted people seeking to abandon unwanted vehicles, dump illegal materials, or simply disappear from their normal lives without leaving forwarding addresses. His job involved cataloging and arranging for the removal of abandoned property, a task that usually involved routine paperwork and occasionally interesting glimpses into the stories of people who had passed through these remote areas over the decades. On the morning of July 15, 2023, almost exactly 27 years after Sarah Mitchell's disappearance, Carlos was investigating reports of an old pickup truck that had been spotted by hikers in an area about 5 miles from the main search zone that had been the focus of the 1996 rescue operation. The vehicle had been partially buried by decades of sand and debris carried by wind and the occasional flash flood, and it had only recently become visible due to erosion that had shifted the accumulated material. What made this particular vehicle noteworthy was its location in an area that was virtually inaccessible to normal traffic. Reaching it would have required either an extremely capable off-road vehicle or a willingness to hike several miles across difficult terrain while carrying enough supplies to make the round trip safely. The truck itself was an older model Chevrolet that had been heavily modified for desert use, with oversized tires, extra fuel tanks, and other equipment that suggested its owner had been someone familiar with the demands of extended travel in remote areas. When Carlos began his routine inspection of the vehicle's interior, he immediately noticed that unlike most abandoned vehicles, this one didn't appear to have been stripped of valuable components or used as a dumping ground for trash and debris. Instead, the cab was remarkably clean and organized, as if someone had deliberately arranged items on the dashboard and seats before walking away from the truck for the final time. The item that caught his attention first was a small silver digital watch placed prominently on the dashboard, positioned in such a way that it would be immediately visible to anyone looking through the windshield. The watch was still functional, its LCD display showing the correct time and date despite having been exposed to extreme temperature variations for nearly 3 decades. Carlos recognized it as an expensive piece of equipment, the kind of sophisticated outdoor gear that serious hikers and researchers used for navigation and data collection. But it was the inscription on the back of the watch that transformed a routine maintenance inspection into the catalyst for reopening one of the region's most notorious cold cases. Engraved in flowing script were the words, "To Sarah, for all your future adventures. Love, Grandma Rose, Sweet 16. Carlos had been working in the desert long enough to know that items like this didn't end up in abandoned vehicles by accident, and his years of experience had taught him to recognize when something routine had the potential to become something much more significant. His phone call to the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department that afternoon would set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately provide answers to questions that had haunted the Mitchell family and the law enforcement community for nearly 3 decades. Detective Maria Santos, who had been assigned to the cold case unit 3 years earlier, specifically because of her expertise in missing persons investigations, recognized the name Sarah Mitchell immediately from her review of unsolved cases in the region. Detective Santos had spent 15 years working various aspects of criminal investigation, but missing persons cases had always held a special significance for her because of the unique trauma they inflicted on families who never received closure or answers about the fate of their loved ones. When she first reviewed the Sarah Mitchell file after joining the cold case unit, several details about the case had struck her as inconsistent with the official conclusion that the teenager had simply become lost and died somewhere in the vast desert wilderness. The discovery of Sarah's distinctive watch in an abandoned vehicle miles from the original search area validated Detective Santos's instincts and opened up investigative possibilities that the original case had never seriously considered. The location of the truck, The careful placement of the watch and the overall condition of the vehicle all suggested that someone had deliberately wanted the watch to be found, but only after enough time had passed for other evidence to be degraded or destroyed by the harsh desert environment. Detective Santos's first priority was to identify the owner of the abandoned pickup truck, a task that proved surprisingly straightforward once she ran the vehicle identification number through law enforcement databases. The truck had been registered to Robert Bobby Crane, a 43-year-old handyman and general laborer who had worked various jobs throughout the Mojave region during the 1990s before dying in a motorcycle accident in Barstow in 2018. What made Crane immediately interesting as a potential suspect was the scope and nature of his work history during the relevant time period. Employment records showed that he had been contracted for maintenance and repair work at several desert parks, camping areas, and research facilities throughout Southern California and Nevada during the summer of 1996, giving him detailed knowledge of remote locations, regular interaction with visitors and research groups, and a plausible reason to be in areas where missing persons incidents had occurred. As Detective Santos delved deeper into Crane's background and associations, she began to uncover a pattern of connections to missing persons cases that the original investigations had never recognized because they had occurred in different jurisdictions and had been handled by different agencies that didn't routinely share information about cases that appeared to be accidental deaths or simple disappearances in wilderness areas. Between 1994 and 1998, at least 5 young women had disappeared under similar circumstances in desert areas of California, Nevada, and Arizona, where Bobby Crane could be placed at or around the time of each incident. The pattern was subtle but disturbing. Women between the ages of 16 and 24 who had become separated from companions during outdoor activities in remote areas, extensive searches that turned up no physical evidence, and Crane's presence in the area as part of his legitimate work activities. The most significant connection was a case from 1995 involving 19-year-old college student Jennifer Walsh, who had disappeared during a camping trip with friends in Death Valley National Park. Walsh had been an experienced hiker and outdoor enthusiast, and her disappearance had puzzled investigators because she had vanished without a trace, despite being in an area that was relatively well-traveled and where her companions had maintained visual contact until just minutes before realizing she was missing. Bobby Crane had been working on a plumbing repair project at the park's visitor center during the week of Walsh's disappearance, and he had actually been interviewed as a potential witness because park employees remembered him expressing unusual interest in the search operation and asking detailed questions about the missing woman and her companions. At the time, investigators had noted his helpfulness and local knowledge, but they hadn't considered him as a potential suspect because there was no evidence of foul play and no reason to suspect that Walsh's disappearance was anything other than a tragic accident. Similar patterns emerged as Detective Santos expanded her investigation to include missing persons cases in other jurisdictions where Crane had worked during the 1990s. In each case, he had been present in the area at the relevant time, had legitimate reasons for being there, and had somehow come to the attention of investigators as a helpful local resident with knowledge of the terrain and search techniques. In retrospect, his consistent presence at multiple missing persons incidents seemed far too coincidental to be explained by chance, but at the time, the different agencies handling each case had no way of recognizing the pattern because they weren't sharing information about cases that appeared to be accidental deaths rather than criminal investigations. The revelation that Sarah Mitchell's disappearance might have been part of a larger pattern of predatory behavior rather than a simple case of someone becoming lost in the desert brought a new kind of anguish to Linda Mitchell, who had spent 27 years imagining her daughter dying alone and scared in some remote canyon, but had never seriously considered the possibility that she might have been the victim of deliberate violence. Detective Santos's phone call informing Linda about the discovery of Sarah's watch and the potential connection to other cases was simultaneously the answer to decades of prayer and the beginning of a new nightmare. The idea that her daughter might have suffered at the hands of a predator who had specifically targeted young women in remote areas was almost unbearable. But it also meant that after 27 years of uncertainty, there might finally be concrete answers about what had happened during those terrible July days in 1996. The investigation that followed would ultimately uncover evidence that Bobby Crane had been a serial predator who had used his knowledge of remote desert areas and his legitimate work activities to identify and target vulnerable young women over a period of several years. His modus operandi had been patient and methodical. He would identify potential victims during their visits to areas where he worked, learn their plans and schedules through casual conversation, and then use his detailed knowledge of the terrain to intercept them when they were separated from their companions or otherwise vulnerable to attack. The careful placement of Sarah's watch in his abandoned truck suggested that he had kept trophies from his victims and had perhaps planned to reveal their locations before his unexpected death in the motorcycle accident prevented him from providing the closure that families like the Mitchells had desperately needed. The watch had survived 27 years in one of the harshest environments on Earth, serving as both a memorial to Sarah's memory and the key that would finally unlock the truth about her fate and the fate of other young women who had fallen victim to a predator whose crimes had gone undetected for far too long. For Linda Mitchell, now in her 70s and facing the twilight of her life, the discovery represented both an ending and a beginning. An ending to the uncertainty and false hope that had defined nearly 3 decades of her life, and a beginning of a new chapter focused on ensuring that Sarah's story would serve a purpose beyond simply providing closure for her family. She became determined to advocate for improved coordination between law enforcement agencies in missing persons cases, particularly those involving young women in remote areas where predators might operate with relative impunity across multiple jurisdictions. The summer heat of 2023 in the Mojave Desert was just as brutal and unforgiving as it had been in 1996. But the landscape that had once seemed to hold only loss and mystery now held the promise of justice and the hope that other families might be spared the ordeal that the Mitchells had endured. Sarah's distinctive silver watch, still keeping perfect time after 27 years in the desert, had finally guided investigators to the truth about what happened to a bright, curious teenager whose only mistake had been trusting in the fundamental safety of the world around her. Detective Santos knew that the physical evidence in the case would be limited after so many years, and that Bobby Crane's death meant that there would never be a trial or a confession that could provide complete closure for the families of his victims. But the discovery of the watch and the connections between multiple missing persons cases would at least give families the peace of knowing what had happened to their loved ones, and it would serve as a foundation for developing better protocols to prevent similar cases from going unrecognized in the future. As she stood in the desert heat at the location where Sarah's watch had been found, Detective Santos reflected on the determination and love that had kept Linda Mitchell searching for answers for nearly 3 decades, and on the tragic irony that a simple piece of jewelry had held the key to solving multiple cases that had baffled investigators for years. The desert remained silent and seemingly indifferent to human tragedy, but Sarah Mitchell's story had finally come full circle. From a promising young woman with dreams of studying the Earth's geological mysteries to a symbol of the importance of never abandoning the search for truth, no matter how much time passed or how hopeless a case might appear. The investigation would continue for months as Detective Santos worked to build comprehensive cases connecting Bobby Crane to each of the missing women. But the discovery of Sarah's watch had already provided the breakthrough that transformed a series of cold cases into a coherent pattern of predatory behavior that could finally be understood and documented. For the families who had waited so long for answers, it was not the ending they had hoped for, but it was the truth they needed to finally begin the process of healing and moving forward with their lives.